I'm Theo Black.
And I'm Sarah Black.
Documentaries are the unloved stepchild of the film industry.
But like all movies, they deserve love.
Especially when they push the boundaries of fiction and non-fiction.
Follow us into the mystery
and fascination that is our world.
What movie are we talking about?
We're talking about Searching for Sugar Man.
So, Searching for Sugar Man came out at the end of July in 2012, which means there was probably nothing else I had any interest in seeing, because as we know, summer is for action blockbusters.
Yeah, you don't watch those.
Yeah, I had very little idea what I was going into, and as soon as I came out, I texted everyone, mainly being you and my parents, our parents.
Everybody on the planet.
Everybody on the planet that I regularly text and said, go see it.
Sugar man, won't you hurry?
I'm trying to remember in my own timeline in my head when I moved back to LA.
We were younger. It was a more innocent time.
It was a more innocent time. I hadn't yet been proven jaded by the world.
Yeah,
Can
5
you
years
proven
ago.
jaded about something? I don't think that's what happens.
Well, you're jaded and then you have to prove it to someone because people don't believe you when you tell them you're jaded.
There we go.
So the movie...
So we went to see the movie and Landmark, and it was awesome.
You loved it.
I loved it. We love this movie. That's why we're talking about it.
Yep.
I didn't know what to expect when I saw it because you told me nothing about it, so I knew nothing about it.
It's better to go in almost knowing nothing. So
yes, it's better to go in knowing nothing.
Maybe you shouldn't watch us right now.
If you haven't seen it, you should go see it. Spoilers. We talk about spoilers. We don't do anything where we don't talk about spoilers. Spoilers. Go watch the movie.
It's great.
It's great.
There's no reason not to see it.
There's no reason not to see it.
And I guess if you hate art and love and happiness, then...
This is one of the few movies that's like kind of happy that you like.
Yeah.
Silver magic ships you carry.
Searching for Sugar Man is a cinematic documentary. It's not a documentary that's just spouting facts at you. It's really a documentary that has a narrative and a full story.
It doesn't pretend to be objective. It has a point of view.
Yeah.
It's a mystery story.
So that night I remember we pull up, way in this kind of isolated part of Detroit, right on the side of the Detroit River.
It's not a list of facts. It's not,
a biography.
It's not investigative reporting, which I do enjoy.
Which you do enjoy. It has a sort of feel towards that, but it's only that atmosphere, not that actual.
Yeah. It does, you're right. I guess it does.
Maybe
Maybe that's why I like it.
Yeah, it has that atmosphere without actually being investigative.
Yeah.
And I even called it not a biography, but it almost is, but it's not really.
Yeah.
It really is a narrative. And that narrative is...
Well, you kind of start with these guys in South Africa, right?
Yeah, so the first shot is the big shot of the South African coast with Seegerman driving down the road, and he's talking about, I got my nickname Sugar Man.
Yeah.
It's this really cool shot, and you're just getting like, okay, so we're in this pretty place, and we're talking about Sugar Man, and what is Sugar Man, and then he starts talking about Rodriguez.
Well, where Sugar Man came from, which is a song by Rodriguez.
It's like this little snippet he's giving you. It's sort of like this small open. They needed it to make sense of what you're about to watch because they want to set up all this atmosphere, so they need something kind of briefly informational.
But they're also setting up the mystery because we don't know who Sugar Man or Rodriguez is. And don't they even mention at this early point, isn't this the first time they mentioned that Rodriguez killed himself?
We didn't know who this guy was. All our other rock stars, we had all the information we needed. But this guy, there was nothing. And then we found out that he had committed suicide.
Yes, they start off with mentioning that Rodriguez killed himself. And then we dive right into the mystery, I think.
Yeah, and we're going back and forth between the origins of Rodriguez, who sang Sugar Man and had 2 albums that didn't do anything in the U.S.
Yeah.
And his growing popularity in South Africa.
Yeah, it starts in South Africa with the Seegerman intro. Then we jump to Detroit.
Really going into how he was this artist, how he was great lyricist, how he wrote great songs, but he had these urban beginning and this, you know, and the grit of Detroit.
It's not just a talent. He's like a wise man, a prophet. He's way beyond just being a musical artist.
They talk about meeting him on like a street corner.
Yeah.
Most of the time, he wasn't coming to my house. He'd say, meet me on the corner of this street and that street. And we would be there. Mike and I would get out of our cars and park our cars, and we'd be standing on the corner, and then we'd look around and he'd be there all of a sudden. He'd just show up.
That's the story they tell.
Yeah.
And it's this great, like, piece of character
Well,
that's where they keep meeting.
They're building up the mystique of, like, who is this person? Because even if you had read the snippet they have for what the movie's about, it still doesn't really, I mean, you still don't know who Rodriguez is because he never went anywhere in the U.S.
He's literally no one, you know, in terms of our generation, our parents' generations, what would have been, his generation. Just nobody knows who he is.
Rodriguez, at that time, had all the machinery in place. Big names, big money behind it. Circumstances were right. Why didn't it make it? That's the big question that today still haunts me.
And it's a combination of, like, people who worked with him, like the musically producers, and then people who just kind of knew him from the bars and knew him from the neighborhood.
I knew that guy, the Sugar Man, and his name was Volkswagen Frank.
It's this great sort of mix of, the record guys are really telling you how sad it was that his records didn't do anything because they were so good, and the people in his real life were like, oh, he was really kind of this mysterious guy.
Yeah, and it's creating so many questions in you as the viewer of like, okay, well, why didn't these songs go well? Like, what is this all leading to? Like,
yeah,
and also there's this hint that he committed suicide.
Yeah.
So how do, what's the full story here?
Yeah, like how do you go from someone who is an artist and doing, his thing, and well, I mean, maybe that the truth is artists kill themselves, a lot of
well, that's the thing, it's leading up with this story that is a sad story. There is this guy who had great talent, but just wasn't getting anywhere.
Yeah, and he wasn't getting anywhere, and they fire him like 2 weeks before Christmas.
And then 2 weeks before Christmas, Sussex dropped him off the label. And the very first line in the song, as if premonition was, I lost my job 2 weeks before Christmas.
Yeah.
I mean, I somewhat doubt the validity of that story because
it's a good story.
It's a good story,
Yeah.
And that's it. The documentary is creating a magnificent atmosphere, story, and character right in the beginning. There's not a ton of plot exactly.
Mm-mm.
I don't know that documentaries usually have strong plot in my own thinking about that, but really it does have a strong story though.
Well, it's a character piece, and even movies that are character pieces tend not to have as strong plots as like an action movie.
Yeah, but it does so well in creating the atmosphere and creating who this guy is. You really want to learn more about him.
Yeah. And
right when you want to learn more about him, they switch to South Africa.
We're back in South Africa again. And that is when we discover that while he is bombing like crazy and no one is buying anything.
Yeah, he spends a few years making records and it does 2 records and they don't get bought.
In South Africa, he is exploding in popularity, in part because he is anti-establishment.
Yeah.
Which at the time he was singing in the United States was... There's a fair amount of anti-establishment going on anyway.
Yeah. He's not that far removed. I guess he's some number of years later than
Dylan.
Dylan, who is the same style.
Yeah. But they don't have that in South Africa because this is apartheid.
At that time, South Africa was very conservative. It was the height of apartheid. And there wasn't television here. That's how conservative it was, because television was communist. It was really, you won't believe.
The common person in South Africa who wasn't
rich or had, could travel.
Just the average Joe did not have a great idea about what was going on outside their own country because the media was under control.
Yeah.
And, they could only listen to certain music. And they even show you in the documentary that, records would get physically destroyed.
When you open the album and take it out from its sleeve, you would see that they have scratched that particular song with a sharp tool to make sure that it would not go out on air.
And so there were people with rebellious feelings, but there was no depiction. There was no mainstream. There was nothing for them to latch on to.
Yeah, you can't go to the cinema and see a movie about it, really. At least
No.
they talk like you couldn't really do that. So Rodriguez was one of the focal points because, for whatever reason, he did become available.
Yeah.
Through bootlegging and stuff, they sort of mention.
However it got here, however it germinated here, once it got here, it spread very quickly.
It's important probably to note briefly that it is white resistance to apartheid. I mean, I assume black people in Africa listened to it and liked it, maybe. I don't know. But it was definitely a part of, white middle-class resistance to apartheid.
Yeah, and it definitely leaked into their own resistance and so on. So it's just a part of the story.
It's just a part of the story. To me, it's this really fascinating sort of, not small, but part of a larger story.
But it's definitely, by no means, I wouldn't call this a documentary about apartheid in South Africa.
Yeah.
It's about
Rodriguez.
And
it includes his place in history, but it's about Rodriguez.
Yeah.
And the South Africans.
Their desire to change things, to, do things differently, to, go against what they were being told.
Any revolution needs an anthem. And in South Africa, Cold Fact was the album that gave people permission to free their minds and to start thinking differently.
And so I'm not exactly sure the full timeline, because that's really not what this documentary is concerned about. Yeah. Dates are not important. It's the story. But eventually, this guy we met at the beginning, Seeger Man, who goes by Sugar Man, he's somehow involved in the music industry. At least he has a record store or something. And I
think he gets the record store later. Because remember, he talks about...
But he's asked to make the liner notes.
He does stuff with music.
So somehow he's involved.
Yeah.
I imagine South Africa, even though it's a big country, I still think there's probably... It's a smaller country than the United States or even California on its own might be. So I wonder how big these whole group, the communities that are into certain things are. But he does some liner notes talking about...
He says something like, he says what they know about Rodriguez.
Right.
Which is, when he talks about it, he almost says it's more of a thing where they it's more philosophical than an actual, because they really don't know anything.
Yeah.
If ever there is an air of intrigue and mystery around a pop artist, it is around the artist known as Rodriguez.
They don't even know how he died. Huh?
Throughout the documentary, they have a couple theories for how he killed himself.
Yeah.
And they're so cut off from the world that they just don't have this information.
Yeah.
They have it about other other rock stars.
Yeah.
They know about the wrong, but they don't know what happened to this guy.
And they're only just starting. They sort of frame this around the time period that they start to get the internet going. Or they get it, and they start to get more news.
Yeah.
And they even talk about some of their own investigation where they investigate the songs.
Right.
And try to figure out where he lives by the song.
Hang on a minute, I'd never checked out Dearborn. I didn't even know if it was a city, but then I thought, actually, that sounds like a town or a city. And I thought, hang on, let me check it out in an atlas.
And eventually, somehow, they reach the producer of one of the albums.
I was sitting in my condo, just having a cup of coffee. I was looking out the window, watching the ocean. Phone rings. It's a long-distance call from South Africa.
Yeah.
And they say they have this great talk, and I want to imagine this conversation because one side is operating off of a completely different set of facts than the other.
Yeah.
And just I know from my own experience, that sounds so unlikely, but I've had, it's easy to have a conversation where you get through the entire thing without ever coming up against the fact that you're talking about two completely different things.
Yeah.
But somehow at the end of the conversation, it goes like, how did he kill himself? Like, we just want to know.
And Mike Theodore was, what do you mean dead? He's not dead. Sixto is alive. He's alive and kicking. The principal artist known as Sixto Rodriguez is alive and kicking and living in Detroit.
And you were so happy.
Yeah, it's like this great moment because this whole documentary it's been a bit of a downer. Like, it's very fascinating. A little bit of a downer, but you already know he's dead. So you're not, like, worried about, he's gonna die. It's like, he's dead.
Well, but I didn't. Here's the thing about it. I had read just enough of a blurb to where I was like, I think this guy's alive. But the way it's built up is so well done.
Yeah.
And so mysterious. And you haven't seen anything. You've barely seen him. It's been very moody.
They don't have any, there's no video footage of him. There's barely any photos of him.
Yeah, you have it a lot in fiction, especially with genre fiction where it's going to end a certain way.
Yeah.
Where you're like, okay, I know it has to get to this point, but how's it going to get there?
Yeah.
And so that's even what I had, where I started to doubt, like, my own knowledge.
Yeah. Did I really believe? Is that really?
Like, no, okay, I had thought he was alive, but I guess he's not, because we're building it up so well.
And he did such a good, it's so good. They do the mystique, they do the part of the resistance, they do the investigative,
and these
then
are
they finally
heavy
get
topics. We're talking about Detroit, which is definitely not in, it's a depressed city, and it's been a depressed city for a while. We're talking about apartheid.
Yeah.
We're talking about suicide. We're talking about failed careers.
But he's alive.
He's alive! Yay!
Yay!
I remember dancing on the spot when I was staying on the phone.
So one of the other tools that's used so effectively, and especially when they make the twist, is that the first half or whatever length of the documentary before the twist is mostly shot at night.
Yes.
It's mostly shot in the smoky quarters of Detroit or using archival footage of apartheid. And all the interviews, for the most part, are sort of dark. Some of the ones with like the pretty people in South Africa are lighter.
But they're either interviewing some guy on the street at night,
yeah,
or they're in someone's office, but it's dark. It's very stylized.
It's very stylized.
Which is something I'm not as used to with documentaries.
They don't do it as often. You have to have a lot of foresight and planning. You have to get a little lucky.
Yeah.
You have to be very careful, and oftentimes in post you have to fix some of the shots you've made, as far as what little I know about documentary making.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in this case, Malik, I can't pronounce his last name, must have had some idea of what he was getting into, so he made a conscious decision.
I think he was working on this for, I think he did a smaller thing first, or some.
Yeah.
I have a feeling he worked on this for a while, but. And a lot of the shots and photography is beautiful, and I think he did it on a low budget.
Yeah,
and
it's amazing the shots he got.
I mean, there are points where it might even be style over substance a little bit, but I think that's kind of what he had to work with. He didn't have money, and then we also haven't mentioned the music.
Right, and well, we haven't mentioned the music, and it's kind of a music documentary, but that's because the story is so gripping.
And the music they play over either like tracking shots,
yeah,
or they'll play over they use sketches.
After the twist, they do a great job of using the lighter locations, and then they do some of his like funner songs, or maybe not funner, but maybe just slightly more lighthearted ones that are slightly more upbeat, and it really fits with the narrative that he's telling.
Just a song we shared out here.
And so at this point, rather than being just a series of clips and dates and interviews, and that can be very well done. It's not to put that down.
Yeah.
When that's well done, it's good.
Yeah.
But you've had just all kinds of different cinematography, photography kind of styles drawing happen. You've had like animation. You've had
album covers
and photography. So it's really pulling from every possible media to tell the story. Maybe they didn't have any concert footage of him, or maybe it was just a conscious decision just to keep the mystique.
Was it a huntsman or a player?
So another thing they do is that even though they found the producer and they know Rodriguez is alive and they're like, okay, good, they haven't actually talked to him yet. But because of the website, actually one of Rodriguez's daughters finds them. And Seigerman actually gets to talk to Rodriguez. And it's like 2 a.m. in South Africa.
Yeah.
And he picks up the phone.
And I said, hello? And a voice said,
Hello, is that Sugar?
and I knew.
They use
his voice.
Rodriguez's voice.
It's a great little piece of,
And
choice.
then there is this like shot of a window and you see Rodriguez.
It's just like, ah!
It's like the second moment, because you're already like, oh, thank God he's alive. And it's all about anticipation, because there's no way you're not gonna, but you've been like waiting for it.
They've built it up so well that when he opens that window and sort of peeks out of it, which is such a planned shot, but it still feels so good to see him.
Yeah.
It's like, it's like I haven't seen this friend of mine in like 20, 30 years.
You feel like you know him, but what you really know is the South African story of him.
Yeah.
Actually, you know the Detroit story of him, too.
Like the early years.
What you don't know is the true story, which is kind of what happens next. There's a bit of an interview with him.
But wouldn't it have been nice to know that you were a superstar?
Well, I don't know what to respond to that.
And then it really does go into, he worked in construction. He did really backbreaking labor. He tried to get into politics.
Yeah, he ran for office.
Yeah, and failed several times. That he has 3 daughters who he, did his best to
raise, and who all, they don't go super into his life, but they definitely had some sort of good relationship with him.
Oh, no, they talk with great fondness about him taking that they did not have money growing up.
Yeah.
It wasn't always great.
But
he takes them to museums, and they have this cultured life, even though they don't have money.
He kind of instilled in me that I can go anywhere I want, regardless of, what my bank statement says, and I'm going, so...
And they have great interviews with people that he knows. And some of these people, I wish I knew their backstories, because they have some great interviews with them.
He approached the work from a different place than most people do. He took it very, very seriously, sort of like a sacrament, He was going to do this dirty, dirty work for 8 or 10 hours, okay? But he was dressed in a tuxedo.
And at some point they get into the money.
It always goes back to the money.
Well, because it's a crazy story. Because at one point, another great interview. The interviews in this are so good. At one point, you don't often hear the off-camera interviewer, but you do hear him a few times. He says,
how popular was the album? Was he as famous as, the Rolling Stones and the Doors? Was it?
Oh, it was much bigger than Rolling Stones.
The guy's like, oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Definitely.
Well, they have 2 record execs because of the 2 different records. And the second one even gives a total of, at least $500,000 or $1 million, which, maybe isn't, platinum or whatever. I don't know how that works. But that's still a lot of friggin' albums.
So then, how did he become this major star? Because he had no idea. That's the other thing. I feel like we didn't hit that. He didn't know.
Yeah, he didn't know. He had no clue. They thought he was dead, and he has no idea.
Because it made it into South Africa bootlegged, and then at some point, the record execs in South Africa, started selling it
Yeah.
and sending money somewhere, but it's like...
There's a lot of bootlegging, I assume, during the apartheid, and then as apartheid?
You said apartheid.
There's a lot of talk of bootlegging during apartheid.
Why do you keep saying apartheid?
There's a lot of talk of bootlegging during apartheid, and the reason we've glossed over it, because the documentary kind of glosses over it a little bit, because they talk about, Rodriguez really not being into material possessions, and, they talk about his daughters and him being, poor, and, we almost sort of forget about it, and now these guys are asking these questions, where did the money go to? And they're like, oh, Sussex Records.
Who did you pay royalties to? To Sussex Music.
Yeah.
And then we talked to the guy who ran Sussex Records.
I have to say, the film industry is an evil, evil, bad place. Full of money just going, no movie ever makes a profit, that kind of thing.
Inventive bookkeeping.
Right. I don't know anything about the music industry, but it almost feels worse. I feel like more rock musicians go bankrupt. And I don't know, maybe it's part of a lifestyle thing. I don't pretend to really know what I'm talking about. I'm just making grandiose statements. But I think it's all really shady.
There's a lot of shadiness. The more money there is, the more shadiness there is.
Yeah, and I guess that might just be a general thing.
That might be just a general thing.
Cross-industry.
But certainly music is no exception.
And one of the things that Charles Avant even says, which the market in South Africa, no matter how popular Rodriguez was still not a huge market. Still.
Why was he poor?
Yeah, still Rodriguez should have gotten whatever.
Maybe he signed a bad deal. Maybe once they let him go, because they don't talk about that.
There's no real answers. You can tell one of Rodriguez's 3 daughters is very upset on his behalf. The other 2 seem more at peace with it. Rodriguez himself seems fairly at peace with it, at least for the documentary. I've read that since then he's kind of tried to pursue more.
He sort of, the way I read it was that he had chosen not to initially, and then a couple years later he's like, oh, I'll look into it. It sounds almost as an afterthought. I wonder if he's thinking about his kids or something.
Yeah, as far as the documentary is concerned, he's a person who might live frugally anyway.
Yeah, we see him living in his house, and it's this burnt-out old house. He probably owns it because of how long he's lived there.
I read something on Wikipedia that he bought it for, nothing.
Yeah,
because it's in this old area.
Yeah, old area, and it's super burned down. It looks like it would just fall over on top of him. Yeah. It's so decrepit. But we meet Charles Avant, and we're like, well, how did all this happen? How did it get that way? Where's all the money? Mm-hmm. And the movie doesn't really have a villain. And it's unfair to the owner of Sussex, Charles Avant or whatever, to say that he is the villain. But he certainly seems like it.
Yeah.
But did you know that he was big in South Africa?
Rodriguez, young man, never happened insofar as I'm concerned.
Because as mentioned, we don't know any of the contracts, any of the legality of anything that happened. But at some point, the Malik, who I assume is the one doing the interview, asks something like, well, he was so popular in South Africa, what happened to all the money? And he's like...
Well, so they've been freed for how long? 3 hours?
And it's like, whoa.
Yeah.
That's some defensive posturing right there.
Yeah. And it keeps going, because what ends up happening is that Rodriguez goes back to South Africa to give a concert.
Yeah, we leave the money behind because that's really all there is to it. Once they, who knows?
The story that Malik wanted to tell wasn't going to end on that note.
Yeah, he didn't. You have to touch that subject.
Yeah.
But then he just moves past it.
Yeah.
And we get to the next section where, Segerman and a bunch of the other people we've been interviewing, who are all members of South African music community, bring him to South Africa.
Next day, he says, Emerson, I got to go on tour. I said, come on, Rodriguez, are you serious?
And to show them arriving and getting off the plane, they use a little cartoon, or it's like an animation, but it's not like a detailed animation. It's so cool.
It's really cool.
And at this point, they're also using some archival footage from that first tour.
Shots of, Rodriguez standing on a rock posing for a photo. It's great.
And you're so into everybody's experience, and just these South Africans who this was their idol who they thought was dead. and now they're getting to meet him, and somehow this documentary has brought you there with them. And you're like...
You're so invested.
You're so excited for them. Like, you couldn't be happier for them. There's a couple interviews and clips about how everybody kind of couldn't even believe this is what was happening.
Is this really going to be Rodriguez? We'll only know if he can actually sing these songs. I mean, we don't know. What if it's just some guy?
It's so nice.
Yeah.
It's so, because you're so invested, they built the mystique. You know, we've talked about it. They've done the great cinematography. It all flows.
Yeah.
You've been talking to the kids. You're with the kids, and the kids are like, what's happening? And you're so invested because the documentary spent so much time in putting you there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even though we've watched this whole story, it's also all set up for the end. Every segment is a setup for the next piece. So when you finally get to this place, everything has been leading up to it. It's so good.
And you want it. You want him to come back and play music for these people who loved him when no one else did. You know, and he does. And it's great. And like, I try not to be a sentimental crier, but I am a little bit of one. And it's just like, I'm sitting there like... You know, holding it in. It's like, you know, he gets up there and everyone, and it's a full stadium of people. It's a huge number of people.
You don't get to go to magical fairy tale land. And this is just one of those moments where you get to go to magical fairyland.
And that's the note they ended on, is really they go into that he continues to live this strange dual life, or in Detroit, he's just this old guy.
Yeah.
And in South Africa, he's this huge older rock star.
Yeah.
And he seems to switch seamlessly between the two of them.
Yeah.
But he had all these, you know, photos and stuff with these giant crowds, 20,000 people, like Woodstock or something. Like, are you kidding me? That's you? I thought it was photoshopped or something. I didn't believe him. But he had all these giant crowds, and he was quite content to just go and sweep up people's lawns or clean up and do manual labor. He stayed.
And so my only real criticism of the documentary is in the end section here. I feel it lingers a little too long on the section where we get to see Rodriguez playing for South Africa. Now, you really want to get there and you really want to see it, so it's great that you see it. But there was a moment where I was watching it and I was like, I think I've seen enough of this.
Whereas I felt like it was the reward. And I still, like, my favorite thing about storytelling is that anticipation. And they even did it at the end because it was what really happened, where he just played the intro to I Wonder. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. And you watch him do it at the concert, and everybody is just like, you know, it's just like, you're just waiting, and the longer you string it out, kind of the more, like, you just get this, like, as soon as it happens.
Man, the pacing is so good in this documentary.
And I felt like the ending was just fine.
Yeah.
Like, that was my reward for just, like, horrible suicide story, like, and how sad it seemed like it was gonna be.
Yeah, maybe that's true. For some reason, it just felt slow to me. I don't know.
So what this documentary was, to me, is one of those truth is crazier than fiction. It was a great story that then a filmmaker took and didn't just make a blow-by-blow documentary about, but chose to create this really interesting documentary that really showed that story off. And I think it's really well done.
I agree. I think this is a sort of pre-internet, the world is so crazy, you know, how these things happen, and you could never know that you were a celebrity across the world if only you had just known, you know, what would life have been different like. But that's not really what the documentary is doing, but it's just that idea of like, well, how did that happen? So there is unfortunately one sad part to this story, not the documentary itself, but the end, which is that Malik committed suicide after he made it, and it's not right after, but like a few years later, I think, like
and
last year or something.
He's not going to make anything for us again.
I know, and it's like super sad, and it's you get to watch this beautiful thing he created,
Mm-hmm.
and it really is about art, and about suffering in some cases and fun in the others, and it's got this great mystery element and this great discovery element and all the pacing and anticipation. And I always wonder what it's like. I'm a creative person, you're a creative person, obviously. We had darker moments in our lives, but what was his life like? I read that he had depression, but that's such a throwaway term. I don't know what that means.
Yeah, but depression, I mean, who knows? We weren't there, but depression can also be such a serious thing that has so little to do with anything actually going on.
Yeah, it can be chemical, as you say.
I don't even want to guess. It's just too bad that he's not still here to make cool things for whatever reason.
Really, we should think about how wonderful the movie he gave us is, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe today, yeah, I'll slip away.
In South Africa, you were more popular than Elvis Presley.
He was a wandering spirit around the city.
He set himself alight on the stage.
He's like the silkworm,
He had this kind of magical quality that all genuine poets and artists have to elevate things, to get above the mundane, the prosaic, all the bullshit, all the mediocrity that's everywhere. The artist is the pioneer.